The weight of wealth can be heavier than the burden of poverty. It's a paradox few understand, but for Jonathan Hayes, a self-made billionaire, it was the undeniable truth. For decades, he had everything the world told him he should desire. Private jets, a mansion overlooking the ocean, a business empire that spanned continents. The financial world admired him, competitors envied him, and the media praised his genius. Yet, despite the luxury surrounding him, an unsettling emptiness grew within him. Jonathan's life had been defined by numbers, profit margins, stock values, and net worth. But numbers couldn't fill the void in his soul. Every achievement felt hollow. Every victory left him more lost. He was a king sitting on a golden throne in an empire of loneliness. Then, one night, as he drove home from a lavish corporate gala, he saw something that would change his life forever. A homeless man sat on the sidewalk, shivering in the cold. His clothes were torn, his hands trembling. But what struck Jonathan the most wasn't the man's poverty. It was his smile. A kind, genuine smile, as if he possessed a secret to happiness that Jonathan had never discovered. For the first time in years, Jonathan stepped out of his car. He handed the man $100 bill. The man looked at it, then looked at Jonathan with a puzzled expression. "I don't need this," the man said, gently pushing the bill back. "But thank you." Jonathan was stunned. "You don't need money?" The man shook his head. "Not tonight. A kind lady already gave me food. But if you really want to help, sit with me for a minute." Jonathan hesitated. The idea of sitting on the dirty pavement in his $1,000 suit was absurd. But something in the man's eyes, peaceful, knowing, made him stay. That night, sitting beside a man who owned nothing, Jonathan Hayes felt more human than he had in years. Jonathan Hayes had not always been a billionaire. He had built his empire from nothing, climbing the ranks of the corporate world with relentless ambition and ruthless precision. Raised in a modest household, he had watched his parents struggle to make ends meet. He promised himself that one day, he would never feel powerless again. By his early 30s, Jonathan had founded a tech startup that revolutionized digital finance. Within a decade, he was listed among the wealthiest men in the world. His days were filled with high-stakes negotiations, global expansions, and extravagant board meetings. His nights, however, were spent alone in a penthouse too large for one man. People admired him. Employees feared him. The world respected him. But no one truly knew him. On the surface, Jonathan was the epitome of success. His mansion was a work of architectural brilliance, designed with every luxury imaginable. An infinity pool, a personal theater, a garage filled with the world's most expensive cars. He had everything, and yet, he had nothing. That night, after his conversation with the homeless man, Jonathan couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the man's words in his mind. "If you really want to help, sit with me for a minute." Why had that simple invitation felt more meaningful than any business deal he'd closed? The next morning, Jonathan found himself standing in front of a homeless shelter downtown. He hesitated before stepping inside, feeling out of place in his tailored suit. A volunteer greeted him with a warm smile. "Welcome. Are you here to donate?" Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. Was that all he was good for? Throwing money at problems? Instead, he asked, "How can I help?" The volunteer seemed surprised but handed him an apron. "You can start by serving lunch." Jonathan had spent years signing billion-dollar contracts, making decisions that affected global markets, but that afternoon, he did something he had never done before. He handed out food to people who had nothing. He saw their faces light up with gratitude over a simple meal. He listened to their stories, stories of lost jobs, bad luck, and broken dreams. For the first time in his life, Jonathan felt a connection to something real. That evening, he sat in his office, staring out over the city skyline. He had spent years accumulating wealth, thinking it would bring him happiness. But maybe, just maybe, the real meaning of life wasn't in having more. Maybe it was in giving more. Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that had settled in his chest. The conversations he'd had at the homeless shelter echoed in his mind. He had spent decades in boardrooms, surrounded by men and women who measured success in profit margins and assets. But the people at the shelter measured life in moments of kindness, in the warmth of a meal, in the hope of a second chance. The contrast gnawed at him. For years, he had believed that money was the solution to every problem. But now, he wondered, if wealth alone was the answer, why did he feel so empty? The next morning, instead of heading to his corporate headquarters, Jonathan drove back to the shelter. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe clarity, maybe a sense of purpose. Back again? The volunteer from the previous day grinned as she handed him another apron. This time, Jonathan didn't just serve food. He talked to people, listened to their stories. There was Robert, a former banker who had lost everything after a bad investment. Maria, a single mother who had fled an abusive home. James, a young man who had aged out of the foster system with nowhere to go. Each story was a reminder that life was fragile, that circumstances could change in an instant. People always assume we're here because we're lazy, Robert said with a bitter chuckle. But most of us had lives just like anyone else. A bad year, a lost job, an illness. It doesn't take much to end up here. Jonathan thought about that all night. What if I had been born into different circumstances? What if one wrong decision had cost me everything? And then, another question arose. What if I could change things for them? Jonathan knew he couldn't keep spending his days at the shelter unnoticed. His absence at the office was already raising concerns. By the third day, his assistant, Olivia, stormed into his penthouse. "Jonathan, what is going on?" she demanded. "You've canceled meetings, ignored investor calls, and skipped the quarterly review." "I've been thinking," Jonathan said, unsure of how to put his thoughts into words. "Thinking about what?" He hesitated. Then, finally, he said it. "About leaving." Olivia's eyes widened. "Leaving? Leaving what?" "The company. The empire. Everything." A stunned silence filled the room. Olivia had worked for him for over a decade. She had seen him fight to build his empire from the ground up. The idea of him walking away was unthinkable. "Jonathan," she said carefully, "you've worked your whole life for this." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "And what do I have to show for it, Olivia? A bank account with more money than I'll ever need? A house that's too big for one person? I'm tired of chasing numbers. I want to do something real." "You do real things," she insisted. "You provide jobs. You fund charities." "No," he interrupted. "I sign checks. That's not the same as doing something." For the first time in years, Jonathan felt certain about a decision. The next day, he made a choice that would shock the world. He announced that he was stepping down as CEO of Hayes Industries. The media went into a frenzy. Headlines speculated everything from illness to scandal. Business analysts called it career suicide. Investors panicked, fearing the company's downfall. His board of directors held an emergency meeting, pleading with him to reconsider. "You built this company, Jonathan," one of them argued. "You are this company." "No," Jonathan said calmly. "I was just its caretaker. It's time for someone else to lead." The business world couldn't understand it. Why would a man at the peak of success walk away? But Jonathan wasn't walking away. He was walking towards something new. He just didn't know what that was yet. The world was in shock. Jonathan Hayes, the billionaire visionary, had just abandoned his empire. The media speculated endlessly. Some called him a genius making a bold move. Others called him a fool throwing everything away. But Jonathan didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt free. But freedom came with uncertainty. For days, he wandered the city, searching for meaning. He spent time at shelters, walked through impoverished neighborhoods, and spoke with people whose lives were nothing like his own. He was no longer the powerful CEO behind a desk. He was just a man trying to understand a world he had spent years ignoring. One night, he found himself back where it had all begun, sitting on a cold sidewalk next to the same homeless man who had refused his money weeks before. Jonathan hesitated before speaking. "I quit my company." The man, who introduced himself as Daniel, smiled. "I heard. People on the streets talk, you know." Jonathan chuckled. "I suppose they do. What now?" Daniel asked. Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I couldn't keep living that life, making more money than I could ever use while people around me had nothing." Daniel nodded. "So, you walked away. That's the first step. The first step to what? Daniel gestured around them. To seeing the world as it really is. Most people in your position never take that step. Jonathan leaned back against the wall. I thought money was the answer to everything. Daniel chuckled. Money helps, sure. But what people need isn't just money. It's opportunity. It's someone who believes in them. It's a second chance. Those words struck something deep inside Jonathan. A second chance. He had spent his entire career building businesses, creating opportunities for investors and executives. But what if he used his knowledge to create opportunities for people who had none? That night, a plan began to form in his mind. Jonathan decided he wouldn't just donate his wealth, he would invest it in people. The next morning, he visited a rundown building in the heart of the city, a place where hundreds of homeless people gathered for shelter in the winter. He met with the woman who ran it, a tireless advocate named Margaret. This place is a lifeline, she explained. But we're running on donations, and we can only help so many people. Jonathan looked around, taking in the broken-down walls, the overcrowded sleeping areas. What if I could do more? Margaret raised an eyebrow. More? I want to build something better. A place where people don't just get a meal and a bed for the night, but a real chance to rebuild their lives. Job training, education, mental health support. Everything they need to start over. Margaret was stunned. That would take millions. Jonathan smiled. Then it's a good thing I have millions to give. Word spread quickly. The billionaire who had abandoned his empire was now investing his fortune into the people society had forgotten. Not everyone was supportive. His former colleagues thought he had lost his mind. Investors called him reckless. Even Olivia, his longtime assistant, struggled to understand. You're giving everything away? She asked, exasperated. Jonathan shook his head. No, I'm putting it where it matters. But you could fund charities without giving up control of your wealth. Jonathan smiled. Charity is good, but it's not enough. I don't want to just write checks. I want to be there. I want to make sure these people aren't just helped for a day, but for a lifetime. She sighed. You're a hard man to convince, and you're a hard woman to argue with. For all her frustration, Olivia couldn't deny that Jonathan was happier than she had ever seen him. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The project, officially named the Second Chance Initiative, faced obstacles from the start. Securing permits, finding willing partners, dealing with skeptical politicians. It was nothing like the business world Jonathan had dominated. But he didn't back down. He poured his energy into finding people who shared his vision. He met with former social workers, educators, even ex-convicts who wanted to turn their lives around. He surrounded himself with people who had lived through the struggles he was trying to fix. And slowly, progress began. Buildings were purchased, transformed into safe housing. Training centers were opened. Counseling programs were launched. People who had once been forgotten were given a new chance at life. One by one, lives started changing. And so did Jonathan. The Second Chance Initiative had begun making a real impact. Formerly homeless men and women were finding work, learning new skills, and rebuilding their confidence. Jonathan spent his days at the shelters, speaking with the residents, listening to their struggles, and helping wherever he could. But not everyone wanted to see him succeed. The backlash wasn't just from the media or former business associates. It came from powerful figures who had no interest in seeing real change. Some politicians criticized Jonathan's initiative, claiming it was too idealistic and would only encourage more homelessness. Business leaders who had once been his allies now viewed him as a liability. Even property developers started pushing back, making it difficult for him to secure locations for new shelters. At one city council meeting, a prominent developer scoffed, "You think you can just throw money at this problem and fix it? People like you don't understand how the real world works." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I was the real world," he replied, "and I know exactly how broken it is. That's why I'm here." Despite the criticism, he refused to stop. He met with policymakers, advocated for housing reforms, and fought against outdated regulations that made it nearly impossible for people to escape poverty. But the biggest challenge wasn't from the outside. It was from the very people he was trying to help. One evening, Jonathan sat across from Robert, the former banker he had met weeks ago. Robert had been given a place to stay, job training, and every opportunity to start over, but he still struggled. "I don't know if I can do this," Robert admitted, staring at his hands. "Every time I think about going back to work, I hear the voices telling me I'll fail again." Jonathan leaned forward. "You lost everything once, but that doesn't mean you have to stay lost." Robert shook his head. "I don't know how to be anything else." Jonathan understood that fear. He had built his entire life around being a CEO, and when he left that world, he had felt the same uncertainty. "You're more than your past," Jonathan said firmly, "and you deserve a future." Some people, like Robert, needed time. Others rejected help entirely. Jonathan learned the hard way that not everyone was ready to change. Some had been trapped in survival mode for so long that hope felt dangerous. But for every person who walked away, there was another who seized the chance. And that was enough. Just as things were gaining momentum, Jonathan faced an unexpected blow. His mother fell gravely ill. For years, he had been too busy for family, too consumed by his empire to spend time with the woman who had raised him. Now, as he sat beside her hospital bed, regret hit him harder than any business failure ever had. "I should have been here more," he said, his voice thick with emotion. His mother smiled weakly. "You were chasing something, Jonathan. I just hoped one day you'd find what really mattered." Tears welled in his eyes. "I think I finally have." She squeezed his hand. "Then I'm proud of you." She passed away a week later, leaving Jonathan with a deep grief, but also a renewed sense of purpose. After his mother's passing, Jonathan threw himself even deeper into his work. He expanded the initiative to other cities, partnered with organizations that provided mental health support, and funded scholarships for those looking to rebuild their education. People who had once been homeless were now running businesses, mentoring others, and giving back to their communities. The billionaire who had once measured his success in dollars now measured it in lives changed. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly wealthy. Years passed, and the Second Chance Initiative became more than just a charitable project. It became a movement. What had started as one man's radical decision to give up his wealth had transformed entire communities. Shelters turned into training centers. Forgotten neighborhoods became thriving hubs of opportunity. People who had once lived in despair now had jobs, homes, and a future they could believe in. And at the center of it all was Jonathan Hayes. Jonathan no longer wore expensive suits or attended high-stakes board meetings. Instead, he spent his days walking through the shelters, talking to people, sharing meals, and listening to their stories. He had become a mentor, a guide, someone who truly understood the struggles they faced. One day, he was approached by Robert, the former banker who had once doubted his ability to change. "I wanted to thank you," Robert said, "not just for the opportunity, but for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Jonathan smiled. "You did the hard work, Robert. I just gave you the space to see what you were capable of." Robert grinned. "Well, now it's my turn to do the same for someone else." Jonathan watched as Robert walked into one of the training centers, ready to mentor the next group of people looking for their own second chance. That moment meant more to Jonathan than any business deal he had ever closed. One evening, Jonathan sat on a park bench, watching children play and families laugh together. Olivia, his former assistant, now one of the key leaders of the initiative, sat down beside him. "You know, you could have lived the rest of your life in luxury," she teased. "Private jets, beachside mansions, the whole billionaire dream." Jonathan chuckled. "I had all of that, and none of it ever felt this good." She smiled. "So, no regrets?" He shook his head. Not one. He had spent his entire life chasing success, believing that wealth was the ultimate achievement. But now he knew the truth. Real wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts. It was measured in the lives you touched, the people you lifted up, and the difference you made. He had once thought he was giving everything away. In reality, he had gained more than he ever imagined. Jonathan's story spread across the world, inspiring others to rethink their own definitions of success. Wealthy individuals began investing in social programs. Cities adopted new policies to help the homeless. His decision had started a ripple effect, one that would continue long after he was gone. And as he walked through the streets of the city he once ruled from a skyscraper, he no longer felt like an outsider. He was home. Jonathan's journey teaches us that wealth isn't just about accumulation, it's about impact. He could have lived in comfort for the rest of his life, but he chose to make a difference. And in doing so, he discovered a kind of fulfillment that money could never buy. So, ask yourself, what does success really mean to you? Is it about what you own, or is it about the lives you touch? The greatest legacy isn't in what you leave behind. It's in the people you help along the way. Because in the end, the richest person isn't the one with the most money. It's the one who gives the most away.